Welcome. It's our third panel of New York Fashion Week and we're going to be talking about the Rodarte show. And I have a wonderful, very dynamic set of panellists with me this evening who will introduce themselves, starting with Hettie.
I'm Hettie Judah. I write about fashion and art for Art Review, and I work quite closely with Mandi, the Fashion Museum in Antwerp.
My name's Mandi Lennard and I run a fashion consultancy called Mandi's Basement.
My name's Jess, Hallett, and I'm a casting director.
I'm Alex Fiore and I'm the editor of Love magazine.
You've all gone very serious. So let's talk a little bit about New York so far and what you guys have been enjoying, what you think's been really strong. Alex, what has been your standouts? Sorry, that was a really bad moment to ask you.
That's alright. I liked Altazara and I liked Alexander Wang very much.
Why was that?
They were strong, they had a distinct point of view. I tend to like what Altazara does. They were also they show immediately after one another, they're friends with each other, but I think their vision's very different. Mm-hmm. This season, Alexander Wang was much kind of looser and grungier. There were lots of layers, whereas Altazara, it had layering as well, but it was done in a very different way. It was much kind of sharper and tighter and much more about kind of this body conscious, powerful woman. And it felt like they were very contrasting ideas, but they were somehow interlinked. And I found that very interesting. And I'm a big fan of a vinyl dress lined in white mink, which seemed like there's something wonderfully sort of Mera Oppenheim and quite perverse about that. So that's sort of my favourite thing in New York Fashion Week has been a vinyl dress lined in white mink.
It sounds like the dress version of the Celine Birkenstock.
Yes, exactly. Birkenstock.
Oh God. What have been your highlights, Hettie? What have you thought been really nice?
I've been tucked away in the 17th century, so I'm afraid
that sounds brilliant though. That sounds very
the founding of America.
So I'm afraid I've not been paying much close attention, but it seems that it's getting quite kind of serious and worky. Is the general impression I've got. There seems to be lots of rather professional women looking things going on. Not much fantasy, so we need for more.
It's quite Puritan.
But Mark by Mark last night was fun, I thought.
Yes.
That was a very fun, uplifting kind of show, which, you know, after there have been some very dark, as in colour, dark shows, all of a sudden Mark comes along. I think it's the nicest show they've done for a while, Mark by Mark.
It's interesting, Hettie, you just mentioned fantasy then, you said, there's not much fantasy, because that's a criticism people make of New York a lot, it's that blanket thing of it's very sort of corporate and it's not particularly innovative, and people always tie that into Rodarte, and I think that's part of the appeal. People are like, it's a bit more sort of intellectual, a bit more stimulating than what else is on the schedule for New York. Do you think that's fair, Mandi or Hettie?
Well, I think one big thing with Rodarte is they don't really take their cue from fashion so much as from art, and I think from their own experiences as well. So there's always that kind of narrative aspect and a different aesthetic foundation for it. So I think it's almost a thing apart, really. It's not like you can kind of see it as being representative of the overall. I don't know then what the influence that they've had on other people is, but there's so much thing unto themselves.
Would you agree with that, Mandi? Because I think that's kind of how they've built their brand in that really clever way, distancing themselves from fashion. They've done a lot of sort of exhibitions and that type of thing. They have really established themselves as an art type label.
I think that's really interesting, especially having Hettie here to make that point, because when you watch the show, as a kind of member of the public who might be engaging with what they've done, that's very different to somebody in the industry who's very aware of all the art layers that they're involved with. And all these projects that they do outside the fashion weeks is almost setting the flavour of very much of who they are, these two intelligent girls who've got their own vision and who are very much not confined by the industry. And again, like Alexander Wang, when we discussed the other night, they had success very, very quickly, phenomenally quickly. I think their first collection was just 10 pieces, 10 couture pieces, and straight away on the cover of WWD, which, working in PR, that's shockingly unbelievable. It's like having a Vogue cover. And the art projects are just really exciting. So when someone like, us are watching a Rodarte show, we're very aware of all those arts projects and their kind of art background that they have.
Why did they capture sort of everyone's imagination right at that moment? Because you mentioned that they got that WWD cover and they did just kind of as you say, sprung up from nowhere. What was it that they did? Maybe Alex, this is quite a good question for you because you kind of followed the shows very closely.
I think they represent something quite different in New York fashion, and I think that's probably why they captured attention and why they've been kind of so consistently championed is, and I don't mean this to sound cynical, but it's the idea that they are this something that's very creative, that aren't really focused on business. When you look at their clothes, they're incredibly expensive for the first part, and they're generally quite handmade. So it's quite difficult to translate that into a commercial reality. And I think for American fashion press, that's quite exciting for them to have somebody that feels almost like they're part more of a European tradition than an American tradition. Although I did ask them about that, and they said that they didn't feel they were part of a European tradition. But I think there is, I mean, for me, there's a geographic distance with the fact they're based in California rather than being based in New York. I think it makes a huge difference to what they do. And there's other designers that have had similar things. Rudy Gernreich in the 60s and 70s was based in California, and I think that made a big difference to the way that he approached fashion. And I think you see that reflected in their clothes, and it's, I mean, maybe we tie it into a European tradition, but actually it's quite linked in with the kind of fantasy of Hollywood as a very sort of a typical thing to talk about. And the idea of that kind of dream factory, which a lot of American fashion isn't really about that. So I think for American fashion press, it's quite refreshing to have somebody that they can champion as these kind of, you know, wing and a prayer, seat of your pants, fantasy people, rather than people focused on business and brand building, which even young designers like Altazara are talking about now.
Yeah.
I just wanted to pick up on the handmade aspect as well, because what's quite interesting is there's a lot of grassroots enthusiasm for them, and what's interesting is that their rise has coincided with this whole, you know, passion for crafts and stuff in America.
It's very covetable.
Like Etsy. And so I think it's almost like the ultimate passionate end point of these girls that sit there devotedly making and crafting these things, and it then rises up to this ultimate point that is Rodarte and this success on the on the international scene.
I think it links with art as well. I mean, they did a couple of years ago, they did an installation in Florence as part of Hettie, and you know, other people have been and shown kind of pre-collections, and there's a big menswear showcase, a big menswear trade show, and Rodarte showed a dozen dresses, and they all went into lacquer afterwards. They were couture pieces that were never commercially produced and went straight into a museum, which I think is very much, that's sort of their approach, and they don't really mind if it's going into a department store or if it's going into a museum. They don't really kind of mind how much they sell.
I think in a way though that's what it loses on the runway as a brand, because at Hettie they were created almost on a couture level to be inspected at very close range. And like you said, you know, when we were looking at the first look of the show, you know, how can you see or appreciate what's gone into that craft-wise?
It's really interesting that you mentioned that, because that's something that I wanted to ask you about, Jessica, obviously because you've worked in casting shows and you know quite a lot about sort of what goes into making a show feel really spectacular and magical. And do you think that Rodarte are a brand that should be looking at, you know, displaying their work in, whether it's a presentation or whether it's an installation or a film?
Well, I mean, obviously a show is the best way to show your work, I think. You know, people do films and presentations, but I think a show is the correct place to show clothes, really, personally speaking. And I think the whole process is, you know, of having looked at the pictures of this show, that it's something that if they do have something that in their heads that they've wanted to put towards it, then it's done very well, you know, because they've got so many different elements coming in. And I think most people who show, probably in New York or Paris, they have one message, and this show doesn't look like one message. To me, there's so many different things going on, and most people when they do a show, they said this is what we want to, you know, this is the message that we have, and it's a lot of the time one thing or flashes of other things, but it's normally one look or one, you know, colour or something, but this is loads of different things. So,
should we take a look at it properly? So this is the opening look, and they were inspired by their childhood and growing up. That's what we know about. Can you talk to me a bit about casting a show as well, Jess? Because I'm really interested in that, and it's not something that we've discussed really before on one of these panels, and what goes into that process.
Well, there's a lot that goes into it. I don't know who the stylist is on the show. I've got no idea. But
I'm not familiar with her, but she's very like them. She's kind of, you know, against the traditional aesthetic of beauty, and
well, which is very interesting. But you know, to have somebody outside of the norm. But I think when looking at these first few looks, I mean, you definitely need a tall girl to wear those clothes. You'd think about, you know, if you think about how many models that you need, if there's one, you know, if you're thinking about having lots of different personalities, as in different hair colours or one hair colour, or if you're going to have, if there's different sections. I mean, Alexander Wang last season he had a brunette section and a blonde section, and a, you know, to show off different things. So you might want a blonde to wear blue or a brunette to wear black. So I mean, there's a lot of different things that you bring into the whole thing. I mean, the walk is vital, and also you don't want to have a model coming out this high and the next model coming out this high. I mean, there's a kind of uniform.
Incredibly complex, I think. No one will probably.
Well, the thing I think is, you think of models being one way, you know, tall and thin, but then there's models that are too tall, because if all the other girls are one height and you have one girl that's taller than the other.
There's shoe sizes that come into it. Maybe they've only got 25 pairs of 39, 40, but you've got 5 girls who are 41. I mean, there's so many millions of things that come into it.
I think it might be you, Alex, that was telling me about something to do with her shoulder width for the Vuitton presentation and things like that, you know, when they all came down the escalator, and there's all those different factors, you know, like exact body shape,
I think with that,
well, especially if these are handmade.
Yeah.
That's a really big thing, because if they're handmade and you have to put a body into a handmade piece of clothing, it's incredibly important, the proportion. You know, you don't want to have to start remaking it or taking in this much on the shoulder and this much on the waist, you know.
With the Vuitton show, it was so they could stand next to each other on the escalator.
Yeah.
It was.
I mean, you could appreciate the precision of that show, couldn't you?
I think that was, you know, for that, the great thing about it was that it was all built around this mathematic precision.
Yeah.
But that's a very specific example, I think, of, you know, there's not many times you need to get them both on an escalator. Although I do remember a Chanel show in the 90s where all the girls wore kitten heels except Kate, and she wore platforms, and they all brought themselves up to the same height.
Yeah, I mean, it is. You know, those things are thought about in advance for sure. You know.
Should we take a look at the fashion?
It's quite interesting talking about it being about their childhood, because, I mean, I'm not sure if it's interesting or depressing, because these clothes sort of look late 80s, early 90s, and like my childhood, sort of.
Yeah, that suit that we just went past looked very disco era, didn't it? I love that.
So are you guys fans of these quite nostalgic references? Because it's funny, Hettie, because we were talking about that, weren't we, with the 90s references when we were talking about pattern.
Yes, and for me it doesn't seem like it was that long ago. It's really
No, me neither.
It's not vintage at all.
We were saying actually at the last review that we can't relate to the designers. They are referencing the 90s now. But I think the great thing about Rodarte is that they would never do that whole retro thing. They always got that brutal contemporary aspect. They'll pull it into now.
How do you think it does always manage to feel so current? What is it that they do that makes it always feel like it's a little bit, you know, of a kind of a futuristic fantasy in a sense? Is it that sort of crafty element, do you think?
I think there's a notion of conversation that takes place in it as well. It's never one simple thing. I mean, I think we were talking a moment ago about the fact that they're never doing something in a particularly simple fashion. There are always a lot of different ideas feeding into it, and perhaps that's partly a function of the fact that it's two people working together with okay, a very close vision, but there is going to be some kind of
Well,
dialogue.
that's look 5, and they've already gone completely somewhere else with the clothes and the casting and the
Interesting
hair.
hair colour there.
Yeah. Fantastic.
Really great.
Do you think that's why it lends itself so well to being exhibited? Because obviously, Hettie, you've worked a lot with sort of curating and putting on exhibitions, and do you think that's that element of conversation is what makes it lend itself so well to that art context?
Well, it certainly makes it extremely enigmatic. You know, we're sitting here kind of finding it quite puzzling to interpret. But I mean, I think the quality of the handwork also obviously feeds into it. And as we were saying, it's quite frustrating not being able to see things closer or in motion, indeed.
It's interesting what you mentioned earlier, Lou, about the idea of 90s referencing, because generally I think the way designers are using referencing now is very different to the way people used it in the 90s. As an example, when in the 90s when designers were referencing the 70s, it felt quite literal. Whereas I think now, and I'm not sure what it is, but I feel that the way that designers are referencing the past, it's much less of a literal revival. I mean, I remember that 70s revival from the early 90s where it was just like the 70s over again. Whereas now when people, you know, which extended to editorials shot as if it was from the 70s and this whole flower child thing. And whereas now when designers are referencing past eras, it never feels quite as static.
Yeah, but people say, you know, it's kind of 60s, 80s, 90s.
Yeah, exactly.
It's not a strict reference.
Do you think that is because designers, they feel like they can have a little bit more freedom? Why do you think it is that they're being less sort of literal in that?
I think there's a lot more
It's a really tough
imagery
question.
there's a lot more imagery immediately available with the internet. I think there's also, I'm always interested in if designers are worried that if they just rip something off, it's going to get found out. Which I'm all,
Do you think that's because of the internet as well? It's much easier to sort of look up someone's...
Well, I think it's just, there's just people that are very, very kind of knowledgeable. And also there's just people that, there are lots of blogs where people can clock if you've ripped somebody off. There was Balenciaga did it better, Tumblr, which is RIP now because too many people complained about it, presumably. But this idea that people will spot if you're ripping somebody off.
Those comparison websites.
Exactly, that
I mean,
kind of thing.
there was a whole couple of seasons where that was going on, wasn't it? And in a way, maybe that was the industry embracing the web, which was very new to a lot of them at the time. So the blogger almost had the power because they were doing these comparisons and they were spending time finding the references.
Where do you guys stand on that, the ethics of that? Because I'm always quite interested because, you know, people kind of embrace it when someone moves to a house and directly references that house's history, which obviously seems quite an obvious thing to see as very positive. But then do you think it is a big problem if you get a new designer, say, working in London that quite strongly references a house from, you know, like the 70s or even 60s? Do you think, why is that seen as such a sort of a taboo in fashion and people are so scared of that?
Of referencing? I don't think people are scared of it. I think people reference a lot. I think it depends on the closeness of the referencing. I think because I do think there are designers. I think there's a way to reference and the way that you reference something initially is by copying it, and then you adapt it. And there's, you know, I think it was Leonardo da Vinci that said that you should learn to draw by copying. You should copy great masters, and then you add your own thing on top of that. And I think with fashion then it's natural to build on, if you see something you like, you build on that base and then you adapt it to your own thought processes and what you're feeling, and everything starts somewhere. I think it's stupid to think that people are going to sit there and come up with an idea off the top of their head. They're not. It's going to reference something that already exists.
I think designers in general are very openly making those references now and being open about it.
They even have Tumblrs and stuff, you know, people will actually.
But isn't everybody asked? I mean, straight away, every interview after the show is like, "What was the idea behind this? Where did you, you know, where did you go to find the idea for this?" I mean, and they're kind of, even if they didn't have one, forced to make up one.
Yeah.
You know, Marc Jacobs was famous like, "Well, I'll just make it up because I just thought they had nice clothes."
I don't think there's any rules anymore.
No. You know, you're immediately questioned on
I was just about to say, Alex was talking about how the kind of references to the 70s and the 90s were much more controlled and overt. I mean, I think there's also this thing with the 90s where you've got this enormous multiplicity of fashion, that you've got so much more being created, so much more being designed, so much more being consumed. So that the designers that grew up in the 90s were probably bombarded with a lot more contemporary fashion imagery than you would have been, not much more diverse.
More street culture, there's different layers of
so,
culture.
I mean, you look at what you've got going on here, you've got kind of, a 90s goth culture and teenagers kind of making up their own stuff in their bedrooms, and different kinds of dressing up happening already with these last few silhouettes. And so it's not just that there's one dominant 90s aesthetic that you're going to be picking up, even at any one stage or in any one season. So I guess there's a lot more to feed off when you're talking about being influenced by the time of your childhood.
Maybe that's what's exciting about Rodarte, because they're almost like filtering through all these ideas and then presenting what they're, they're not making any excuse for it. They're just presenting clothing that, has inspired them.
And they're not chained to, what everybody else is doing, obviously.
Yeah, they did a collaboration with when it was the 50th anniversary of A Buddha Souffle, the movie, and they actually designed a new interpretation of the New York Herald Tribune T-shirt that Gene Seberg wore in the movie. And again, that project fitted so well, because they are anti this kind of convention of beauty, and of course in that movie at the time, with her cropped gammon haircut and her skinny pants, and just wearing this kind of a branded T-shirt at the time, that was quite radical. So it was, I think the collaborations they do are very fitting to them.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you in particular about that sort of branding and that PR side, because they've done a lot of stuff, but they've never seemed to dilute sort of their sort of special points, whether it was doing their Target collaboration or even doing things like, like the Black Swan thing, which obviously was hugely publicised. Do you think they've been incredibly clever and
I think they're incredibly passionate, you say. I think that when, all the designers get approached to do all these projects the whole time, and you've got to understand that if someone rings you up and says, I'd like to do a swatch watch, it might not be right for you. So if you're a young designer and you need the money and you're paid a fee, there's real pressure that you should do a collaboration like that. But what they've done is they've thrown themselves into these projects. So when they guest edited Lula magazine, it was Charlotte Gainsborough on the cover, photographed by Nan Goldin, and there was Sophie Calle feature inside it. Really exciting, very, art driven. And all these projects.
And female.
Yeah, all these projects really fit, and they're the building bricks of the brand. And Alex said earlier, about them not doing the commercial route. They have actually done collaborations with Gap and Target. Yeah. And it's funny, because the irony is there is an element of exclusivity about it, because it's still limited edition.
I think that's I always find that really funny that they've been able to do that, and no one would ever accuse Rodarte of being mainstream, but you think, and that shows how sort of strong they are with their brand, I think.
Didn't they even do something with Starbucks?
Yeah, they did Starbucks last year. Yeah. What did they do with Starbucks?
I can't remember, but I do remember they did something.
That was funny.
God.
I mean, it might have been a charitable reason.
So what do you advise your young designers that you're working with about doing collaborations? Because I guess you raised a really interesting point, when it's really hard when you don't have a lot of money, and someone goes to you and...
It's hard for the designers, because I remember one season, this was so annoying. Some kind of sweetener, Sweetex or somebody, was calling all the designers to collaborate and do a Sweetex packaging, and I was so annoyed about it, because it was hardly any money they were paying them. And of course all the designers I work with, they're all skint and they needed the money and they wanted to do it, but as part of my vision for that, whatever, it was like, oh my God, don't you dare have that on your CV, this is just a killer. And it's real dilemma. But I must admit, a lot of the brands are very savvy, and I do a lot of projects with brands, and I must admit the brands are very, very sensitive to what the designers want to do now. That's changed a lot. Yeah, I think the options for the designers are quite amazing.
Should we press on with the collections? Yeah. Let's look at some clothes.
That's nice.
The next look.
What are those little side bits there?
Do you think that's the light, the neon light behind? That's what I was trying to work out.
No,
I think
the lines.
Do you think, Hettie, do you think the light installation is quite arty?
Dan Flavin going on.
When it's Bureau Batak that do their sets. I remember when when SHOWstudio did the live stream, and you kind of didn't get it at the show, but it was about sleepwalkers in Texas who were sort of being murdered, you know, as you do for a fashion show. But they have all these kind of crosses in the forest where they died, like their graves. And the catwalk was arranged in a series of intersecting crosses, and of course you didn't get it when you were sat in it, and you just wondered why the models were walking around in these kind of weird things, but overhead it was 3 intersected crosses, which is something they kind of work with Bureau Batak to devise these kind of
I like that though, when you go to a
pieces.
show like that and you're almost like unsettled by the set. You don't want to try and understand it, but it kind of enhances the experience of watching the show, rather than just going to a bare white space and seeing an up, down, up, down.
Yeah.
And Rodarte do always manage to, you know, get quite an emotional response from their audience. I think that's something very unique that they manage to do. What are your thoughts so far on the looks, Alex?
I'm interested in how varied it is as a show, which I think is something that you were talking about, Jess, that it's very, you know, very different looks, which is also something they did last season. There was that variation between kind of printed chiffon and fringe leather, and really sort of showing the breadth. I mean, you know, it's changed again now. It's sort of Mexican.
Yeah, there's a lot
That
of
might have been
different
a
ideas.
bedspread when they were a kid.
But there's a lot of different ideas going into it, isn't there? There's, you know, the one look doesn't necessarily give you any idea of what the next look's going to look like.
There's a little bit more continuity in this show though than their previous shows.
I mean, it's interesting to think about it in line with what Hettie was saying about the 90s, this idea of it's quite fragmented in the way that if you're thinking about their childhood in the 90s, then 90s fashion is quite fragmented as well. It seems to be referencing lots of different things. There's also something, I remember I interviewed them and asked them how would they define contemporary fashion. I have no idea why I asked them such a dreadful, pretentious question, but I did anyway. And they said they saw it as cinematic. And this idea that cinema is the medium that we experience.
And also, wasn't
The world,
MTV around that period? Wasn't that the first time that people were getting those imagery of and that was mashups, that whole MTV Raps, the whole visual, what's his name, David Kelly, and people like that. It was all about kind of chopping and changing.
But I think as well it's just being in America and having 300 channels and flicking between the different channels. It's like
This looks making me laugh also. Yeah, they did tons of, they were the first, weren't they? Because we were in the UK with our kind of Channel 4 was so excited because it just started. But that's quite interesting because is that a body tucked in? Because it makes me think, well, actually in the 90s you did wear a body, and a little occupational hazard of wearing a body was that it didn't tuck
in properly.
Yeah.
It's a bit Wonder Woman kind of busk thing coming up there, isn't it? It looks quite stiff.
It looks like
doesn't
teenagers
look 90s
going
to
to
me
a
at all.
Halloween
Does
party.
it? Does that look 90s to you?
Madonna
Not really.
90s?
Yeah.
That's more Madonna 80s, surely, with the lace.
Yes.
And the,
But even the skirt is quite 80s, isn't it?
I do like the
A big
idea
skirt
though
like
of the
the little
underlayer.
heathers, the little heathers, the kind of a major art skirt.
I think there's also a little slice of make, do and sew in the collection as well, because growing up, you know, we don't know what kind of childhoods they've had, but I think as a young child, you kind of, especially if you're into fashion or art, you almost like want your own personal identity. It's very frustrating if your parents are kind of buying you clothes to look a certain way, and I think that you are very imaginative as a child if you want that identity, and I can see that in this.
It's funny you say that because actually one of the silhouettes earlier, which had a lot of work around the collar and quite high neck, I was thinking about that dress that Molly Ringwald makes in Pretty in Pink at the end. It's got all this stuff going on. It's kind of it's got the lace and it's got the frills and it's got the high neck and the bows and everything happening. And it was
I remember doing things like, you know, I wanted drain pipe jeans, and like I didn't have drain pipe jeans. I couldn't afford drain pipe jeans. I had jeans with a little flare. Don't work out the year. But I remember sitting for hours and hours and hours sewing and making these jeans.
But then I couldn't get them on and I had to take them out again.
Yeah, you sew yourself into them, I remember.
But also the 90s for me was about chopping things up. I mean, we used to just get dresses and just get the scissors and, oh whoops, too short, never mind.
Well, I was interested in Mandi because before you mentioned, that street culture kind of explosion, and I think that's something that's quite interesting to see in this, as it does look almost kind of amusingly street-based. It looks like young kids putting it
And that's the point about street culture, isn't it? Because the kids on the street don't have money, but they, these wonderful ideas are coming through that inspire us.
I do remember that they've talked about kind of being inspired by the skater kids that are around them in California as well, which I can't. Maybe
was
it was
kids' 90s, Larry Clark.
Yeah. I mean, maybe it was Santa Cruz or something. They said it was. I remember because we were talking about the cinematic thing, and they were saying it's where The Lost Boys was filmed, which apparently is what they say when people ask where they grew up. They're like, we grew up where The Lost Boys was filmed, because people won't know the place. But when you say it's where The Lost Boys was, then people get this idea immediately of how it looks and sort of the aesthetic of the area and everything like that. They think that's very, it's, and I think for them as well, it very much sums up their attitude to where they grew up as well, and how that influences their kind of creativity.
I think there's a very spooky aspect to this collection as well. I mean, some of these clothes look like they could have been worn by Chloe Sevigny in Boys Don't Cry. That kind of, backwater home where again you have to make do with these kind of pass-me-down clothes as well.
It's almost a more literal interpretation of that crafty thing that we were talking about before that makes them so special. That intricate handmade. It's more obvious with the tie-dye, but it's kind of nodding at that.
They did actually win the Swiss Textile Award, which is a really critical award. I mean, it's real industry that. And they were recognised then for their textiles. So
that's part of the dress, or it's on top?
Yeah, I was trying to work that out before.
So is it 3 layers? So there's one that almost looks like it's kind of some kind of skin layer that's stitched on top of the silk.
I mean, that looks very sharp, the white.
Yeah.
I think it must be stitched down to stay that sort of graphic. And I guess that's sort of the tension between this stuff that looks very homemade, but actually a lot of it is very precise, because otherwise it would look incredibly messy, especially when you're mixing all of these different elements together. And it's quite, I mean, I like it. My favourite stuff from last season was the fringe leather. I like it when they go quite bad taste and quite dodgy, because otherwise it can all get a bit saccharine, evening dresses and a little bit Black Swan. But I like it when they sort of screw it up a little bit. I think that's it's nice when they give it a bit of an edge, which I think is what they're sort of expected. And also in New York, there are all these kind of young, I don't want to say young cool brands, but yeah, you know what I mean. Like there are all these kind of younger designers now that are doing things that are kind of pushing envelopes and questioning taste, and you can't go and be too sweet now, in a way that, unless you're going to be so sweet that it makes it a little bit sick. I think what they do is it's always about that boundary between good and bad taste.
But also what you were saying earlier about them not being in California away from everybody probably gives them the freedom to...
Yeah, because that's a lifestyle choice, isn't it, being in California. I think New York is, again, tiny scene, you get sucked into the industry. I know from designers in London, they have this incredible pressure to go to all the openings and events to be seen out and I don't like the word network, but they like to see everybody and share ideas. But, if they were in New York, that is pretty intense, that little fashion scene there. It is really tiny.
And this always looks like it was done with an attention to what people completely outside of fashion are wearing, which I think is quite interesting. There's that street thing that we were talking about before, but also just being outside of that.
Like kind of outsider art, I guess. There's that kind of reference to. I mean, this is very, crochet rug on the back of Roseanne's couch, sort of. Let's be honest. This is more to the bad taste section.
Kind of drugged out beach parties as well, isn't it?
Maybe that's what their mum inspired them wearing an outfit like that.
I think their parents are quite serious, aren't they? I think
they're lecturers or something.
But this print's come up quite a few times, so it's interesting because it's kind of a fractal as well as looking a bit like it's a tile, but it also looks like it could be something that's actually just done on a computer, and it's actually been like a single rose that's always been turned around.
Or a poppy or something.
And I'm kind of feeling a little bit of the ethnicity through the graphics, actually. Maybe, a kind of hint of Navajo mixed in with it, so
Yeah, I
there's
was
a kind of
gonna say, it feels a bit-
authenticity to it.
Yeah, with big stiff collars.
Yeah, and that's very like that, you know, in some of the areas of LA. But isn't it funny how that backdrop pulls it? If you didn't have that backdrop, it would be very different, wouldn't it? So they're presenting it in their own way.
There are a lot of oversized collars that then become asymmetrical because they're so big they're sitting off one shoulder as well. I've noticed that some. Alex, can you see what that print is?
I don't have my contacts in, I can see very little. I must confess.
We can have a look at some close-ups at the end, actually, which might help us out a little.
That'd be great.
I love the shoes.
I love the shoes
Is that a
as
sock
well.
with a shoe? That's what I'm...
It looks like a really feminine version of a crepe rock and roll shoe. Maybe
Or-
their
or a
dad wore a
moccasin.
shoe like
Like
that.
an Indian moccasin.
We're reading
Yeah.
too much into
Oh, we agreed not to overanalyze, didn't we?
The print looks a little bit like
I
it
like
could be
those shoes.
stonewashed denim.
Those shoes are nice.
Like
Yeah.
chiffon printed to look like stonewashed
I
denim.
was also looking at the plinth that's the base of the and it's got a bit of a kind of concrete feel
Yes.
to it as
Mm.
well, actually.
Yeah.
It looks a little bit, you know, like walking through a really sort of horrible street with all the nightclub lights a little bit with that neon and that concrete.
I saw it more Venice Biennale than that.
Did you?
Yeah, kind of some fabulous Californian museum with lots of them.
Yeah.
I think
Whole
Lou's
new
seen,
section here.
Lou's kind of seen Magaluf in here, and
They're very collected, you know, by institutions, their clothing, and they are in the permanent collections of a lot of, and they've had a lot of exhibitions themselves. They've been in that Gothic exhibition.
I think those flesh things is a styling thing. I don't think that flesh thing is attached to the dress, the
Neck.
A medieval
Tunic, yeah.
tabard thing.
You need to be tall.
Yeah. What do you think of the casting? Because there's been some of the really big girls in here. You know, we saw Cara.
I think they
there's
have the
Lindsay.
same casting agent that does a lot of the big shows like Marc Jacobs. I can't remember who it is, but yeah.
Well, yeah, they've got some great models in the show, and you know they're going to be very powerful on the runway. The way that they walk, they're very confident. The girl with the multicoloured hair at the beginning. Maybe they just wanted somebody that was a specific person that they thought of, because it's not in tune with the rest of the dark, you know.
was it Charlotte
These
Free?
girls.
I don't think it was
didn't
Charlotte
look like
Free,
Charlotte
no.
Free.
Yeah. It's funny when you get a girl like that appears, because you'll see it in one show and you'll think that they're very much connected to that show, and then they
Yeah.
start popping up in all the shows.
Yeah.
There was a girl in Paris one season who had tattoos all over her, and again in the show that I saw her in, it was very much like, oh, you know, this is cool, and then suddenly she was in all the shows. So
Well, a lot of the time one person takes a chance and everybody else follows.
As you were saying, the styling, there's basically dancewear going on.
I think,
There's
it is.
leotards
Can we
and
see the last
leggings
look?
and-
I don't think if you bought that
Yeah.
grey off-the-shoulder dress,
Yeah.
you'd get the...
And almost everything's got a kind of dance outfit going on in
Yeah.
it somewhere.
But it was very dance then, wasn't it? It was all about fame, or, you know, everybody was wearing the leg warmers
Let's
and
get
stuff.
physical.
Yeah.
What-
Yeah, Olivia.
It's all a bit more 80s.
What do you
Yeah,
think
it
of
does
that
look a
letter?
bit more
Oh, in the
80s
press,
to me.
80s, 60s,
80s.
80s, 90s.
Yeah.
Well, the dancewear is definitely 80s,
yeah.
isn't
But
it?
again, that's the great thing about fashion now. You don't need to excuse yourself for the references you're taking, and I think you know, you just present what you want to present. You can say, oh, I hint of that, whatever, but you don't almost like use that as your excuse. It's almost like you're presenting something. You don't want to be judged on the references. You want to be judged on the overall finished outfit.
But do you think it is going to start getting a bit meta when you get people referencing 90s references of the 70s?
I think it's already been happening.
I think.
But
I
also
mean,
you-
my favourite was Prada referencing Prada's reference of. I love it when specifically. I think Prada has this great power to be able to reference her own references and you know, revive her own prints like she did last winter. There's such power in that. It's also a measure of your own power to be able to be like, here's me referencing what you're all referencing, but I did it first.
But that's what Ralph Simmons did in the menswear show as well.
Exactly.
So what are our first reactions to this show? Does it sort of make us think anything about Rodarte in general, or anything about sort of the mood of this season? We're going to go silent now because that's a
Well,
big
I mean,
question.
there's so many ideas in there, and maybe that's back to them feeling, you know, free from the constraints of the fashion industry as a whole, that, you know, they're not doing the same as everybody else. They're showing a lot of colour, which not very many people have done this season so far. And, you know, they've put all their ideas out there.
Which that's how they would usually do a show.
You know, whereas some people would say, you know what, maybe we should just reduce it down to, you know, let's show, you know, just a small part of it.
That probably
You know,
is.
yeah, probably they probably got loads more.
I mean, I do wonder if it's if it is too varied. In my opinion, I don't think there's really a message. I'm not getting something that I really take away from this. It's, we knew before we started that it was about their childhood, which was a useful hook for us to look at and see something in the outfits. Yeah, but otherwise I think sometimes you look at that and I can't help but think, well, maybe your childhood was a few years ago, because this sort of looks like other people's referencing of these times. In comparison, for instance, to what Altazara did, which, sorry, I ramble on about it, but I think because it's very precise and it had a very precise point of view, it doesn't hold up as well as that, or what Alexander Wang did, which again was this very precise, very honed, very defined point of view, a very specific proposal. This doesn't feel like a specific proposal. When I go into a fashion show, I want people to convince me that this is the way the world should look. I say it over and over and over again. And I don't find this particularly convincing. You're trying to tell me too much. I don't really know what you want to say because you're babbling. It feels like visual babble at times. And there's beautiful things in there to pull out, but I'm not convinced. I'm not convinced.
Exactly, it has to be believable, you know. From my experience when I'm working, people usually say to me, the girl that wears these clothes is, or the man that wears these clothes is, this is what we need to make people understand they are. And
I think going back to the art projects, you know, when you look at, let's say, I'm sure that Rodarte would hate this, but celebrities, yes, they do dress everybody. Yes, Michelle Obama has worn it in the Oval Office or whatever. But when you look at some of the celebrities who are in the mix, you know, they've got the artist and filmmaker Miranda Julie, they've got Rooney Mara, they've got Kim Gordon. So they do attract, yeah, exactly. And I think it will always be a babble what they do, and that's why I always question a show for them. Because I think, you know, like Alex said about Hettie, going to be able to intimately engage with the clothing in a non-show situation. But I think this is much more coherent than the show before. The show before was very restricted, very, you know, the clothes were quite fitted with a lot of the kind of warrior feel about it. In fact, I think one editor said were you inspired by Game of Thrones? But this is a lot freer, it's a lot easier, there's no tailoring. It's kind of a very bohemian offer from them.
I mean, I did weirdly, the overwhelming feeling I got from this was one of melancholy. It's quite odd. In the last two collections, the last one was very, you know, as you say, empowered kind of medieval warrior princess. The one before was that extremely eye-popping kind of Van Gogh palette with, you know, quite playful little girl dresses coming out. And this one, I mean, I really wish I kind of didn't know that somebody had said that it was about a child, because it does seem like it's kind of alienated 15-year-old girls. And
I love that about it.
Yeah, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but it has got this kind of melancholy outsiderish feel to it. And, you know, with the kind of outsized bits that were kind of slipping off the shoulders, and with the... I mean, it may, you know...
I think I'm also, personally, it's odd when you think about fashion as a subjective or an objective. If you try to be subjective with fashion, trying to be objective with fashion, it's very difficult, because I think it's always subjective. I mean, for me, I like clothes that are quite forceful and quite empowering. So perhaps that's why I related a lot more to parts of what they did last season that seemed quite hard-edged. And when you look at what Alexander Wang did this season, and certainly what Altazara did this season, it's very hard, it's quite tough. It's quite sort of trussed up. And I think my personal taste is for that, which is why I like autumn winter. I like tailoring, I like coats, I like proper clothes. I like stuff that looks like it was very difficult to make. That's sort of, you know, the thing that I'm into. And I think with this, a lot of it looked quite simplistic, and that was perhaps my issue with it. You know, I'm sure there are beautiful things in the showroom, but again, it's this idea of making an impact as a show and having a strength to the clothes and a strength to the message.
You raise a really interesting point here, kind of about the purpose of the show, which is something you also touched on, Mandi, because this is very interesting to me, because our last discussion we did was the Victoria Beckham show, which is obviously an incredibly tight edit.
Sorry,
it's very
I love
clear.
how they put that model with the coloured hair with the
With
greyish
the-
outfit.
Yeah, it's great.
It's like a grown-up. It's like a very grown-up, womanly outfit,
So I think, where
quite
does this
professional,
But
with the
the-
teenage hair.
But then it reminds me of your
coming
first
from-
job, you know, when you have
Yeah.
to go and work in a bar or a restaurant when you're like 16
Well, listen,
and your
this is the
hair's
season, I
awful.
think, where a lot of people are referencing Donna Karan from the 90s.
True.
Yeah.
That's
The
interesting.
bodies.
Yeah, so I wanted to ask you about this idea of the purpose of the show.
Also,
because-
oversized jacket.
Yes, and there's a
It's not
great
glass.
coat in
Yeah.
that vein as well. Maybe it was the dad's coat.
It's very don't tell mum the babysitter's dead, which is a reference I've been dying to get into something.
Oh God.
As Lou well
Can you
knows.
remember the question?
No, it's just Alex was talking to me about that film last night and then
Oh, funny.
got it in there. I can't remember the question, which is this idea of the purpose of the show, because we had our Victoria Beckham discussion, and it was the last
That's
one we
nice,
did,
I
and
like
it's
that.
it was so short, the show, and so concise. You know, it's 28 looks and it's really edited, and it's really telling, given what you guys were just saying about how this doesn't feel as tight, and it doesn't feel like it's one message. But then that makes me sad to think that, you know, a show has to be something that is just like almost like a press release and with an email title.
But I think she's been
Well-
really faithful to her customer. They've been very faithful to their customer with
Yeah,
the show.
and if it is these
And I think that's
characters
very
who are
important.
wearing it, then that's important. But I think somebody like Victoria Beckham is probably really conscious of the fact that all the people in the audience have to go to 20 shows a day. And if, you know, an 8-minute show is probably quite refreshing in a day of 20
I think
shows.
everybody
rather
should be-
than-
I don't think this would have been
Everybody
a
should be
particularly long
conscious
show,
of
was
that.
it?
Do you, Alex?
What?
Do you think everyone...
I think every designer should be conscious of the age in which they show, the way in which they're showing. Every designer should be aware of that. I don't think there is, or there have been shows where I think there is a place where you can suspend all of that and you can go. When I used to go to Galliano shows, when it was Galliano, there was very much I will be here for 4 hours and I don't really care because this is wonderful.
It's an event.
But I think
Yeah.
you have to be aware of the environment in which you're showing, especially something like New York and the schedule of New York and the demands of New York and the demands of people's time and attention. I think you really, and it's about tailoring your message to the medium. It's, you know, if you had to write a press release, you couldn't try and fit as many words as you would fit in a novel. That just doesn't make sense. No one would be able to read it. It would have to be printed very small. And that's kind of, with this, it's like you should use the outfits and you should use everything you have at your disposal to communicate your message and to communicate it as succinctly and as precisely as you can. That's sort of what I like in a fashion show. I like precision. And I like coming away and knowing what you wanted to tell me.
I think they've very much done that here, though. I would say that they have precisely communicated their message. That outfit is very, very them. When I think about people that I know that are big Rodarte fans, they want a comfortable piece in a season. They don't want a new look. They want to add to their existing pieces, and it's very, very comfortable. As a brand, the people that buy it, they really covet it. And was this a long show anyway?
That's such a feminine
This was probably
look, though,
quite a
isn't
good
it?
show.
35, 38 looks altogether, so...
It might have been quick.
It's very romantic, that look, compared to
Yeah.
these strong
We
shapes
see the
here,
back
which
of
is
that
kind of
one.
Mugler-y
It
in a
looks like
way,
it has
isn't it?
Those
Old
wings
Mugler.
embellished coming from the back or something.
Yeah, it's almost like a tattoo, you know, onto the...
Yeah. Is there a way to see the back of that?
I don't think...
Yeah, that one does seem to jar with the rest of it, doesn't it?
Yeah, but I mean the other way, these are very floaty and
But
romantic, these dresses.
The midriff, the quality, the relief
yeah.
on the material. It's quite beautiful, really, that.
Mm.
There's a lot going on there, really, isn't there? Actually, I think it goes back to what Lou was saying about going for the first job thing. It's like, I'm looking really grown up, I'm wearing a neck scarf.
There's that element, of a little girl trying to dress herself when she's like 15 and not quite sure how to do it.
And also I think there's an element of how your parents would dress you, because that's quite almost like you look respectable.
It's like you've gone back upstairs because your mum's been like, put on a neck scarf.
That's a very feminine look again.
Yeah.
Whereas the previous one was very kind of aggressively...
And that contrast reflects last season as well. You did have that kind of the toughness with that, as Alex was talking about.
Beautiful.
Yeah, me too.
I mean, I guess if it's about childhood, there is this idea of discovering yourself and about discovering your identity, and this idea of discovering your identity through clothes, which I think everybody can relate to in a way. There is this idea that as a teenager, you do to a degree dress to a character, I think. You talk about expressing yourself, but really it's part of, this is how I want to be and this is how I'm going to dress to reflect that.
Can you go back to the outfit, the look before that? Just because this reminds me of, when I was thinking about, how I should dress as a kid. My mother had fabulous clothes. I didn't really know what was what or who I was. But, going through her wardrobe, this kind of, that almost feels like, trying on your mum's shoes and keeping on your little socks, and that my mum had Oscar de la Renta and things like that, and all these layers of tulle, and it's almost like I tried them on and I loved them, but I wouldn't go out. Just those emotions, I can just see that.
A white legging really reminds
me of being a teenager.
They kind of remind me of Clockhouse at C&A, those white leggings.
Tammy girl.
Tammy girl. God. You've got weirdest references.
I do have the weirdest references.
So I'm conscious of time. So what are our sort of gut reactions to this?
It's really good to look at the detail actually, because I think it's changed.
Again, my idea of the clothes.
Which is how I felt last season, Jess. I was exactly like that. I could really appreciate them in this situation where we were studying it.
Which brings it back to how you want to present your clothes, because some of these dresses have got a lot of other things on top. They've got a body, they've got leggings, they've got a jacket, they've got beading. I mean, there's so much on there, not just the dress. So
I think the problem with presenting clothes in a museum context is that you don't have the human body inside them, and however gorgeous the handwork is and however detailed the embellishment is, it's really important to see them in motion and to see
which is why the John Paul Good exhibition was so brilliant, because there was lots of mechanical movement and everything was very alive, even though it was static.
And that's interesting, because on that notion of something being alive, we've all mentioned the word emotion quite a lot when talking about this collection, and it does feel alive. There is a story to it. It does feel like there's a girl within that outfit, and a story behind it, which I think is an interesting strength of it, even if it doesn't sort of pull the whole collection together. So where do you think, where's this kind of taken the brand for you guys? Where has it taken Rodarte? What would you say the codes of Rodarte are, and how are we seeing them here? It's quite a big question. Alex, answer me.
I'm not going to say that. I don't know. I don't really like talking about codes of houses and DNA, that horrible, disgusting phrase that people seem to think is acceptable to use in reference to clothes.
Didn't say DNA.
Yeah, I know you didn't, but it's just one of my bugbears, along with the phrase hero piece, which I despise. Oh, it's horrible. It means like a nice jacket or something. So those are my two most hated fashion phrases at the moment.
It's not the response I was expecting to that question.
I mean, I think there is the handwork there. There is which is very much a trademark of everything they've done. There's always been that sense of the hand behind it. I think it's really what they've built their brand on. I think, and there's also this. It was very interesting when we started to talk about that sense of otherness, because maybe I'm relating more to what other designers are doing, but certainly it's not like anything that we've seen in New York. It's, it stands apart.
But I think that's what you're saying is a problem that all the editors have somewhere like New York and London, when the schedule's so packed. I think you have it more in London because there's so much good stuff, and it's like one after the other. There's no palette cleanser in between these shows. You have to go, and it's your job, and you have to be alert and take it all in the spirit of you know, if you're an editor, you have to take it seriously. If you're a buyer, you have to keep the eye on the customer. But in New York, that schedule is really hard. I mean, a lot of boring shows.
Very. Kathy Horan this season said there are too many labels and not enough ideas.
Yeah.
Which I think is very harsh, but quite telling. It is this idea that you really need to cherry pick the designers out that are significant and that really matter.
But in London, if you don't go to a show, it's really naughty. I remember once I was waiting at a show that we were doing, and the editors had all got a little gang and gone for lunch, and I had to go in the restaurant and get them out. You know, it's almost like the schedule is so packed, there's so much good stuff. At the first opportunity, they want to bunk off, you know, and they're not allowed to, or if they're a national newspaper, they're committed. But in New York, that is a tough schedule. You talk about The Outsider, Karen Walker shows in New York, and she does a fabulous collection. She's always celebrating The Outsider, and I had a look at her show online this morning, and it was, you know, it was typically great, but it wasn't, again, that's her customer, and she's faithful to that customer. But again, as a kind of, you know, putting the ideas out there, that's not what, she doesn't need to do that. She's got it, and she can do that if she wants to, but she doesn't need to do that for the sake of it. But again, there are so many shows like that where they've got the established customer, but they have to show for the commerce. And that schedule, if you look through it,
you can see that being shot in on a beach somewhere or in the desert, can't you, for a summer story? I mean, they're going to pull those dresses because they're visually, you know, exciting for us to look at on a magazine page. Yeah.
And particularly with this set as well, you get this real sense of there being slippage between two worlds, where you've got this kind of rather staid, formal flower print and what could have been a very kind of quite conservative collar on a tea dress, then becomes outsized and slips into this Californian fantasy of surf culture.
there was a hint of Bill Cosby in that.
But that looks like a kid who's changed her dress, doesn't it? You know, it looks like that's a dress that her mum bought her, and then she's a...
But then when we're looking right down at the bottom, it's got this very kind of romantic kind of sweep across the floor as well. So it's a kind of seat between the kind of world of adulthood or the parents' projection of the way they're going to want to.
It's quite interesting to think about it. It's interesting to think about it as a fantasy as well. I think that's maybe it stands very apart from what's been shown in New York, because there's been this commercial reality to a lot of the pieces. Even Altazara, he was saying that his most expensive pieces are the pieces that sell the best. So whereas there's been very much this focus on realism, a lot of suiting, a lot of black, this does stand apart in that way. It's more of a fantasy. I think it's quite interesting to think of it as this fantasy of California, this idea that you can buy into this fantasy of California, and that's really what they're presenting. We've talked a lot about the reality of their childhood, but maybe it's not, maybe it's the memories of their childhood and this kind of fantasy.
Nostalgia.
Exactly. And we've all had this kind of nostalgic link to different things from our own past, you know, which is so, in a sense, maybe that's it's kind of achievement. It's made you dream a little bit, which is quite interesting.
But typically it's not retro.
Yeah.
I think that shows their talent.
It does. Yeah, it makes. I'm really interested by the fact you said that idea of fantasy and how it makes us think of something, because that's the first question I asked was about what their special thing is, and everyone said fantasy. So maybe in that sense, you know, it's always going to be a triumph. Should we give them a round of applause for round things up?